All right, and we are back for chapter 10.3, which is on the War of 1812, an often overlooked or forgotten war from early on in American history. So we're going to start like we normally do with a little bit of review. I know it's been a few days. Hope everybody had a nice 3-day weekend. But we're going to talk about some stuff we covered in chapters 10.1 and 10.2. So to bring everybody back up to speed, you should all know this stuff by now. The United States completed the purchase of the Louisiana Territory from France in 1803. And I'm going to bring up my little pointer here again right now. This white area on this map right here represents the Louisiana Territory that we bought from France. You can tell it's a really, really big part of land, or a big piece of land. It's all or part of 15 states from the United States as it is now, and it doubled the size of the United States in just the signing of one document. So Napoleon Bonaparte of France, that's this guy over here, he had been eager to sell the territory. It would have been really, really difficult and expensive to secure the area. Remember, they're all the way off the screen across the ocean in mainland Europe in France. So it'd be really, really hard to protect this territory from either the Spanish over here, the Americans, or the British. So it also, France was in dire need of money to fund its ongoing wars in Europe, including its conflict with Britain. So because of these two reasons right here, Napoleon said, you know what, I'm going to just take advantage of the opportunity right here. I'm going to sell this land to the United States. It worked out well for all of us. And then, of course, you remember between 1804 and 1806, Lewis and Clark and the Corps of Discovery explored and mapped the Louisiana Territory and beyond. And during the first decade and a half of the 1800s, France fought a series of wars against Britain and other powers of Europe. I'm going to go out on a limb here. I think this painting is by Jacques-Louis David, who is a French painter. I could be wrong, but I don't think I am. That's Napoleon Bonaparte right there. All right, so back up to where we left off. So we got to think of what America's situation was in this part. So the other two major powers that we're going to talk about in this story right here are Britain and France. You see their flags on the screen right now. Britain was known for having the strongest navy in the world. Their ships on the high seas could match and outdo anybody else. France, on the other hand, had the most powerful land army. You have to remember at this time in history, the United States was not as powerful as it is right now. It was still a really, really young country, and it was caught between these two countries as they fought each other. We just kind of got stuck in the middle of it. So we're going to start looking at the causes of the War of 1812. So impressment. This doesn't mean you're impressed or blown away by somebody. Impressment means something very, very specific in this case. So the British, as they're fighting this war against France, they really, really need more sailors for their navy. And they were having a hard time finding people to sign up to be sailors during the war. So the British needed a way of getting more sailors. Well, you might ask, why were they having a hard time finding people to sign up during a war? Well, the idea of being a sailor in the British Navy was pretty appealing for people. That was a highly thought of Navy. A lot of times people say it was the best in the world. Maybe there's no argument about that. It was the best in the world at the time. But when it's peaceful, it seems like an appealing option for some folks in Britain. But when there's a war going on, it's really, really difficult to get people to sign up. I mean, they're going to be in danger. The conditions are going to be really, really poor. It was hard to get enough sailors for their ships. So what do the British do? Well, they begin seizing or capturing American merchant ships. And American sailors are kidnapped and forced to serve in the British Navy. That's called impressment. So they were more or less kidnapping American sailors and making them be part of the British Navy. That did not make Americans very happy, nor should it. Here's some more causes. Trade. This is a theme for this entire class since the beginning of the year. We've been talking about trade a lot. During the first 10 years of the 1800s, Britain and France continued to be in conflict with one another. Both of these countries tried to block the United States from trading with their rival country. This means that the British tried to prevent the United States from trading with France, and the French tried to keep the U.S. from trading with Britain. The idea behind this was that if Britain was getting supplies to fight the war against France from the United States, and France was getting supplies from the United States to fight the war against Britain, that each of these countries that was engaged in this conflict could limit the resources of their opponent by cutting off trade with the United States. So in 1807, Congress passes the Embargo Act. And under the Embargo Act, the United States is trying to get away from all this conflict with other countries, said they were no longer going to export goods from its ports. Nothing was coming out of the United States. And in addition to that, because of the impressment and the ongoing interference with trade, American ports would be closed to British ships. The British ships cannot come to American ports anymore, and America will no longer export any goods. This was a terrible idea, and it had a terrible impact on the economy. Why? Well, think about all the merchants in the United States that make a living off of shipping things over to other parts of the world. Maybe not necessarily just Britain and France, but other parts of Europe and other countries. They now have lost their jobs. They have no income. This is a terrible idea, and it damages the economy. So here's some other causes for the war. Many people in the United States believed that the British were trying to restrict American expansion in the West by encouraging the resistance of Native American tribes. So this character over here, you saw him on the title slide for this presentation today, is a guy called Tecumseh, and he was a chief in the Shawnee tribe, and he wanted all Native American tribes to unite to resist the expansion of America onto their lands. His idea was that it would be very, very easy and convenient for America to pick off one tribe at a time, but it would be much more difficult for the United States to fight a united front of multiple, many, many Native American tribes. So he called for an alliance of tribes, and this always reminds me of something we already learned about in this course. Remember this flag, the join or die flag? Kind of reminds me of the idea that Tecumseh had here, that in order to survive and defeat a common enemy, all tribes should unite as one. So here's when the war begins. On June 18th, 1812, President James Madison, that's him over there, Jefferson's no longer in office, he asked Congress to declare war on Britain, and they do. So here's something to remember going into this story. Britain is way more powerful than the United States in those days. We're a very, very young country. We're vulnerable, and Britain had the power to absolutely squash America. There were some people that worried that if Britain came with all their force into this war and defeated the Americans, would we go back to being a colony again? That doesn't happen, of course, but there were some people that were actually concerned about that. More people in America were concerned about that than there were British people who had that as a goal for this war. So you have to remember that Britain was still busy fighting Napoleon all the way on the other side of the ocean. So that's going to give America a positive start to this. They're not going to deal with the full force of the British. America launches attacks against Native Americans and British where they can find them. A lot of this fighting takes place in the Great Lakes region and in Canada. Some of you might know where Prairie du Chien is out in western Wisconsin on the Mississippi River. There was actually a battle from the War of 1812 fought in Prairie du Chien. But a lot of stuff takes place in the Great Lakes region and in Canada. America has some successes in this phase of the war. Some people say, well, why Canada? Well, you got to remember that was still a British colonial possession at the time, and most of the British were over fighting against the French. So the only place we could fight the British after we declared war on them at this point in the war was in Canada. So second part of the war, we break it up into two parts. The second part begins when Britain has wrapped up the fighting with France. Napoleon is defeated in 1814, and now they don't have to divide their forces between North America and Europe. They can focus on the conflict in America. And they do, and they demonstrate their power and their might over the United States by attacking Washington, D.C. So a lot of people overlook this in history, but the British actually burned the United States Capitol, and they burned the White House. They set them on fire. And Dolly Madison, who is the President James Madison's wife, she escapes the fire with an important portrait of George Washington. This is a life-size portrait of George Washington in the White House. And she did not want to see that fall into the British hands or have them destroy it. So she tried to unnail the frame from the wall, but she couldn't do that. So she ended up taking a knife and cutting out the painting around its perimeter like this and taking it with her. And when the White House was restored a few years later, it went back to hanging up on the walls in there. So one last note. The Battle of New Orleans in 1815, this is going to be our first introduction to a guy who's going to become a big figure in our story here in the 1820s and 30s and beyond, this Andrew Jackson. So after being pummeled or beaten badly by the British, America had one major victory at the end of the war. A small army under General Andrew Jackson, yes, the guy in the $20 bill, destroyed a much larger British force at New Orleans in Louisiana. This had really no impact at all Jackson didn't know it. Nobody really knew it at the time, but the treaty to end the war had been signed 2 weeks before this battle even happened. Well, how does that happen, you might say? Well, it's just because communication was so slow in those days. We didn't have telephones, we didn't have text messages, we didn't have the internet. So, between the signing of the peace treaty and this battle, 2 weeks had passed without Jackson and these soldiers knowing that the war was actually over. So the war was completed with the signing of something called the Treaty of Ghent. Ghent is the name of a town in Belgium, I believe. So really, what they say is that it meant that the only thing that came from this treaty was that things went back to the way they were before the war began. So no territory changed hands between the United States and Britain, and trade disputes at the beginning of the war, those were not taken care of, and neither side made any big gains. So this was a big war, I guess, at the time, with really, really nothing to show for it for either side when it was done. So that's the War of 1812. I miss you guys. Hope you're doing well.